The information being presented throughout this video will be based off of 2 books that I've published. This one being my 3rd book, Quasi-Dimensionality, an accidental blueprint of the Infinite Probability Field, with the rest of the information being based off my 2nd book, Metaversal Decipherment, the Art of Meaning Mechanics. And in particular with this book, it might serve you to look at this portion of the book called Sequential Tenuity, the Mechanism of Manufactured Continuity, with this word sequential tenuity meaning that which happens in sequence, occurring simultaneously, which is not a word that I coined. It was a word coined by Roxanne Swainhart. Also, watching the movie Arrival will best help to understand this concept. Also throughout this book, looking at the portion called Making the Number, which explains what numbers are and the meaning behind them, which also helped to understand the concepts explained throughout this video. And with that out of the way, let us begin. What I believe Terrence Howard was alluding to by saying 1 times 1 equals 2. Now, the initial premise of this video will be based off the idea that the number 1 is something which cannot be defined by itself, which is why the number 2 and beyond would have to help in making that happen, as that very dynamic will cause 1 times 1 to equal that of 2, since the number 1 is the first number which can't exist on its own, thereby separating the functionality and overall nature of the number 1 from all other numbers. For the square root of 2, being an irrational number, is due to the number 1 being treated as both a placeholder number for the sake of multiplication as if it were the number 0, but with a value attached to it, and that of a number which doesn't have to grow on its own through the use of multiplication in order for it to have the ability to affect every number which is to come after it. So in that sense, it is important to realize that the number 1 is being seen as a number which has to exist somewhere along the multiplication process, despite not having a way to become anything else by having it multiply itself into becoming something else, given that the way that the number 1 is handled within the process or operation of addition is the initial cause for this dysfunction, when you consider that the only reason that the number 1 is even expected to exist in some capacity within the multiplication process without it actually being multiplied into a different state is because the number 2 is both made out of several iterations of the number 1 put together, and it is a concept which is its own kind of identity, meaning that the need to create and sustain some form of continuity between concepts, such as the case with numbers, is what forces the multiplication process to fit the number 1 within that system without having to accept that the number 1 is not something which can exist without all of the other numbers bound to come after it, in the same way that all of those numbers are not able to fully exist on their own without the number 1, which is another way of saying that the relationship between numbers is something which takes place within multiple directions simultaneously instead of the existence or emergence of numbers being contingent upon their being a starting point for everything to continue from, if any of them are to exist at all. And yet, this is an idea which tends to be counterintuitive to how our minds work, considering that our senses are innately set to perceive of everything through variation, multiplicity, of there being numerous things which exist within our reality at any given time, and how that perception is what led to the practice of counting in the first place. Which means that if there wasn't always a way to differentiate one thing from another, then everything wouldn't just exist as one thing. Everything would exist as just that, everything, which would make the act of defining anything as a singular concept out to be an impossible task. Therefore, nothing can be defined as a single thing unless there is another single thing to help with making a distinction between the two, which would lead to at least one thing being perceived as existent because several things are now being perceived as existent. In other words, numbers function like words, where a single word would find itself being used within a sentence, and how the meaning of the word would be associated through the context being set into place by the words which surround that particular word, with every single one of those additional words having each of their meanings determined by the context which is set forth by those other words, which causes each of the words to have the source of their existence come from the surrounding words, as that would suggest that there isn't an actual source for any of the words being used in this hypothetical sentence. This means that from a numerical framework, cause and effect is entirely dependent on the context that it was framed by. Or if I was to describe it another way, I would say that the number 1 is like a mirror, and multiplying it by 1 is like adding another mirror to the equation, with both mirrors reflecting each other as endless mirrors are being reproduced through each layer of each other's reflection of each other, until the end result is a recursive reproduction of mirrors. After all, if the number 1 is said to function like a mirror, as the holding up of that mirror to the presence of another number, which is to come in front of it, such as 2 times 1 equaling 2, because the number 2 is an object being reflected back to it by the number 1, and any number which is to come in from the position of 0, such as 2 times 0, then that would lead to it equaling 0, due to 0 not being a number but a placeholder, which means that it can't reflect anything if it's not supposed to be anything. Then the number 1 can't be defined by itself, as I said during the very beginning of this video. But as opposed to the idea that the number 1, when it is encountered by another iteration of the same kind of number, will only lead to that number being defined as just that number. It is the case that the number 1 is different from every other number, even though it is also responsible for the existence of every other number, which is why it stands to reason that the recursive effect brought on from having the number 1 reflect onto itself, the number 1, by bringing them in front of each other, is for all intents and purposes the proof as to the gap which can't be mended between the number 1 and every other number. If the number 1 times the number 1 creates an infinite loop of a reflection process, but not the production of a specific number or identity. Hence the idea that if there wasn't a perception of multiplicity where things are able to exist, are able to be distinct from each other, then the number 1 wouldn't be able to exist without there being the concept for the number 2 and beyond, which is what causes the number 1 times the number 1 to not become the number 1, nor for the number 1 times the number 1 to become the number 2, but instead for the entire process to reveal that the number 1 is birthed from the number 2. And that the opposite of this is an equal measure true.